Welcome to Storytime with Snaggy Wolf, where the moonlight meets microphone and every tale glows with a spark of magic. I'm your host, Snaggy Wolf, headphones on, mic hot, and ready to guide you through stories that stir the soul, tickle the imagination, and sometimes howl at the moon. So take a seat on the log by the fire, let the fireflies dance, and settle in for a journey through legends, mysteries, and midnight musings. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the pack, because every story is better when it's shared.
The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 4. But sleep in the long run proves greater than all emotions. His thoughts soon wandered again. He lay there, warm as toast, exceedingly weary. The night soothed and comforted, blunting the edges of memory and alarm. Half an hour later, he was oblivious of everything in the outer world around him. Yet sleep, in this case, was his great enemy, concealing all approaches, smothering the warning of his nerves. As sometimes in a nightmare events crowd upon each other's heels with conviction of dreadfulest reality, yet some inconsistent detail excuses the whole display of incompleteness in disguise. So the events that now followed, though they actually happened, persuaded the mind somehow that the detail which could explain them had been overlooked in the confusion, and that therefore they were but partly true, the rest a delusion. At the back of the sleeper's mind, something remains awake, ready to let slip the judgment. All this is not quite real. When you wake up, you'll understand. And thus, in a way, it was with Simpson, the events not wholly explicable or incredible in themselves, yet remain for the man who saw and heard them a sequence of separate facts of cold horror, because the little piece that might have made the puzzle clear lay concealed or overlooked. Far as he can recall, it was a violent movement, running down towards the tent doors that first woke him and made him aware that his companion was sitting bolt upright beside him, quivering. Hours must have passed, for it was a pale gleam of dawn that revealed his outline against the canvas. This time the man was not crying. He was quaking like a leaf. The trembling he felt plainly through the blankets down the entire length of his own body. Defago had huddled down against him for protection, shrinking away from something that apparently concealed itself near the door flaps of the little tent. Simpson thereupon called out in a loud voice some question or other, in the first bewilderment of waking he does not remember exactly what, and the man made no reply. The atmosphere and feeling of true terror lay horribly about him, making movement and speech both difficult. At first, indeed, he was not sure where he was, whether in one of the earlier camps or at home in his bed in Aberdeen. The sense of confusion was very troubling. And next, almost simultaneously with his waking, it seemed the profound stillness of dawn outside was shattered by a most uncommon sound. It came without warning or an audible approach, and it was unspeakably dreadful. It was a voice, Simpson declares, possibly a human voice, hoarse yet plaintive, and soft, roaring voice close outside the tent, overhead rather than upon the ground, of an immense volume, while in some strange way most penetratingly and seductively sweet. It rang out, too, in 3 separate distinct notes, or cries that bore in some odd fashion a resemblance far-fetched yet recognizable to the name of the guide. D-J-Go. The student admits he was unable to describe it quite intelligently, for it was unlike any sound he had ever heard in his life, and combined a blending of such contrary qualities, a sort of windy crying voice, he calls it, as something lonely and untamed, wild and of abominable power. Even before it ceased, dropping back into the great gulfs of silence, the guide beside him had sprung to his feet with an answer, though unintelligible, cry. He blundered against the tent pole with violence, shaking the whole structure, spreading his arms out frantically for more room, and kicking his legs free of the clinging blankets. For a second, perhaps 2, he stood upright by the door, his outline dark against the pallor of the dawn. Then, with a furious, rushing speed before his companion could move a hand to stop him, he shot with a plunge through the flaps of the canvas and was gone. As he went so astonishingly fast that the voice could actually be heard dying in the distance, he called aloud in tones of anguish, terror, that at the same time held something strangely like a frenzied exultation of delight. Oh, oh, my feet of fire, my burning feet of fire. Oh, this heightened fiery speed. Then the distance quickly buried it, and the deep silence of the very early morning descended upon the forest as before. It had all come about with such rapidity that, for the evidence of the empty bed beside him, Simpson could almost believe that it may have been a memory of the nightmare carried over from sleep. He felt the warm pressure of the vanquished body against his side. There lay twisted blankets and a heat. The very tent yet trembled with the vehemence of the impetuous departure. The strange words rang in his ears, and as though he still heard them in the distance, wild language of suddenly stricken mind. Moreover, it was not only the sense of sight and hearing that reported uncommon things to his brain, for even while the man cried and ran, he had become aware that a strange perfume, faint yet pungent, pervaded the interior of the tent, and it was at this point, it seems, brought to himself by the consciousness of his nostrils, were taking this distressing odor down his throat, that he found his courage, sprang quickly to his feet, and went out. The gray light of dawn that dropped, cold and glimmering, between the trees revealed the scene tolerably well. There stood the tent behind him, soaked with dew, the dark ashes of the fire still warm, the lake white beneath a coating of mist, the islands rising darkly out of the objects packed like pool, and patches of snow beyond among the clearer spaces of the bush. Everything cold, still waiting for the sun, but nowhere a sign of the vanished guide, still doubtlessly flying at a frantic speed through the frozen woods. There was not even a sound of disappearing footsteps, nor the echoes of the dying voice. He had gone, utterly. There was nothing but the sense of his recent presence, so strongly left behind about the camp, and this penetrating, all-pervading odor. Even this was now rapidly disappearing in its turn. In spite of his exceeding mental perturbation, Simpson struggled hard to detect its nature and define it. But the ascertaining of the elusive scent, not recognized subconsciously, and at once a very subtle operation of the mind, and he failed. It was gone before he could properly seize or name it. Approximate description, even, seems to be difficult, for it was unlike any smell he knew. Acid, rather, not unlike the odor of a lion, he thinks, yet softer, not wholly unpleasing, with something almost sweet in it that reminded him the scent of decaying garden leaves, earth, and the myriad nameless perfumes that make up the odor of the big forest. Yet the odor of lions is the phrase with which he usually sums it up. Then it was wholly gone, and he found himself standing by the ashes of the fire in a state of amazement and stupid terror that left him the helpless prey of anything that chose to happen. Had a muskrat poked its pointed muzzle over a rock, or a squirrel scuttled in that instant down the bark, he most likely would have collapsed without more ado and fainted, for he felt about the whole affair the touch somewhere of a great outer horror, and his scattered powers had not as yet had time to collect themselves into a definite attitude of fighting self-control. Nothing did happen, however. A great kiss of wind ran softly through the awakened forest, and a few maple leaves there rustled trembling to the earth. The skies seemed to grow suddenly much lighter. Simpson felt the cool air upon his cheek and uncovered head, realizing that he was shivering with the cold, and making a great effort, realized next that he was alone in the bush, and that he was called upon to take immediate steps to find and secure his vanished companion. Make an effort, accordingly, he did, though an ill-calculated and futile one, with that wilderness of trees about him, the sheet of water cutting him off behind, and the horror of that wild cry in his blood. He did what any other inexperienced man would have done in similar bewilderment. He ran about without any sense of direction, like a frantic child, and called loudly without cease of the name of the guide. "Defago! Defago! Defago!" he yelled, and the trees gave him back the name as often as he shouted, only a little softened. "Defago! Defago! Defago!" He followed the trail that lay a short distance across the patches of snow, and then lost it again where the trees grew too thickly for snow to lie. He shouted till he was hoarse, until the sound of his own voice and all that unanswered and listening world began to frighten him. His confusion increased in direct ratio to the violence of his efforts. His distress became formidably acute, till at length his exertions defeated their own object, and from sheer exhaustion he headed back to the camp again. It remains a wonder that he ever found his way, and it was with a great difficulty and only after numberless false clues that he at last saw the white tent between the trees and so reached safety. Exhaustion then applied its own remedy, and he grew calmer. He made the fire and breakfast, hot coffee and bacon, put a little sense and judgment into him again, and he realized that he had been behaving like a boy. He now made another and more successful attempt to face the situation collectedly, and the nature naturally plucky coming to his assistance. He decided that he must first make as thorough a search as possible, failing success in which he must find his way into home camp as best he could and bring help. And this is what he did, taking food, matches, and a rifle with him, and a small axe to blaze the trees against his return journey. He set forth. It was 8 o'clock when he started, the sun shining over the tops of the trees, and the sky without clouds. Pinned to a stake by the fire, he left a note in case Defago returned while he was away. This time, according to a careful plan, he took a new direction, intending to make a wide sweep that must sooner or later cut into any indication of the guide's trail. And before he had gone a quarter of a mile, he came across the tracks of a large animal in the snow, and beside it the light and smaller tracks of what were beyond question human feet, the feet of Defago. The relief at once he experienced was natural, though brief, for the first sight he saw in these tracks a simple explanation of the whole matter. These big marks had surely been left by a bull moose that, wind against it, had blundered upon the camp, and uttered its singular cry of warning and alarm in the moment its mistake was apparent. Defago, in whom the hunting instinct was developed to the point of uncanny perfection, had scented the brute coming down the wind hours before. His excitement and disappearance were due to, of course, to his. Then the impossible explanation of which he grasped faded, as common sense showed him mercilessly that none of this was true. No guide, much less a guide like Defago, could have acted it in so irrational a way, coming off even without his rifle. The whole affair demanded far more complicated elucidation. When he remembered the details of it all, the cry of terror, the amazing language, the grey face of horror when his nostrils first caught the new odor, that muffled sobbing in the darkness, and for this too now coming back to him dimly, the man's original aversion for this particular bit of country. Besides, now that he examined them closer, these were not tracks of a wild moose at all. Hank had explained to him in the outline of a bull's hooves, or of a cow's, or a calf's too, for the matter. He had drawn them clearly in the strip of birch bark, and these were wholly different. They were big, round, and ample, with no pointed outline as sharp hooves. He wondered for a moment whether bear tracks were like that. There was no other animal he could think of, for caribou did not come so far south this season, and even if they did, they would leave hoof marks. They were an ominous sign, these mysterious writings left in the snow by unknown creature that had lured a human being away from safety. And when he coupled them with his imagination of that haunting sound that broke the stillness of dawn, the momentary dizziness shook his mind, distressing him again beyond belief. He felt the threatening aspect of it, and stooped down to examine the marks more closely, and he caught a faint whiff of that sweet yet pungent odor that made him instantly straighten up again, fighting a sensation almost of nausea. Then his memory played him another evil trick. He suddenly recalled those uncovered feet projecting beyond the edge of the tent, and the body's appearance of having been dragged towards the opening, the man shrinking from something by the door when he woke later. The details now beat against his trembling mind with concrete attack. They seemed to gather in those deep spaces of a silent forest about him where the host trees stood waiting, listening, watching to see what he would do. The woods were closing in around him. With the persistence of a true pluck, however, Simpson went forward, following the tracks as best he could, smothering these ugly emotions that sought to weaken his will. He blazed innumerable trees as he went, even fearful of being unable to find the way back. calling aloud at intervals a few seconds the name of the guide. The dull tapping of the axe upon the massive trunks, and unnatural accents of his own voice, became a length sound he even dreaded to hear, for they drew attention without ceasing his presence and exact whereabouts. And if it were really the case that something was hunting himself down in some way, that he was hunting down another. With a strong effort, he crushed through. With an instant, it rose. It was the beginning, he realized, of a bewilderment utterly diabolical and kind that would speedily destroy him. Although the snow was not continuous, laying merely in the shallow flurries over more spaces, he found no difficulty in following the tracks for the first few miles. They went straight, as a ruled line, wherever the trees permitted. That stride soon began to increase in length, till it finally assumed proportions that seemed absolutely impossible for any ordinary animal to have made. Like huge, flying leaps they became. One of these he measured and thought he knew that stretch of 18 feet must be somehow wrong. He was in complete loss to understand why he found no signs on the snow between the extreme points. But what perplexed him even more, making him feel his vision had gone utterly awry, was that Defago's stride increased in the same manner, and finally covered the same incredible distances. It looked as if the great beast had lifted him with it and carried him across those astonishing intervals. Simpson, who was much longer in limb, found that he could not compass even half of the stretch by taking a running jump. The sight of these huge tracks, running side by side, slightly evidence of a dreadful journey in which terror or madness had urged impossible results, was profoundly moving. It shocked him in the secret depths of his soul. It was the most horrible thing his eyes had ever looked upon. He began to follow them mechanically, absent-mindedly almost, ever peering over his shoulder to see if he too were being followed by something with gigantic tread. And soon it came about that he no longer realized what it was they signified. These impressions left upon the snow by something nameless and untamed, always accompanied by the footmarks of the little French Canadian, his guide, his comrade, the man who had shared his tent a few hours before, chatting, laughing, and even singing by his side. Chapter 5. For a man of his years and inexperience, only a canny Scot, perhaps grounded in the common sense and established in logic, could have perceived even the measure of balance that of this youth somehow or other did manage to pursue through the whole adventure. Otherwise, two things he presently noticed, while forging pluckily ahead, must have sent him headlong back to the comprehensive safety of his tent, instead of only making his hands close more tightly upon the rifle stock, while his heart, trained for the wee kirk, sent a wordless prayer winging its way up to heaven. Both tracks, he saw, had undergone a change, and this change, so far as concerned the footsteps of man, was in some indiscernible manner appalling. It was the bigger tracks he first noticed, and for a long time he could not believe his eyes. Was it the blown leaves that produced odd effects of the light and shade, or that the dry snow, drifting like finely ground ice on the edges, cast shadows and highlights? Or was it actually the fact that the great marks had become faintly colored? For around the deep, plunging holes of the animal there now appeared a mysterious reddish tinge that was more like an effect of the light than anything that dyed the substance of the snow itself. Every mark had it, and had it increasingly. This distinct fiery tinge that painted a new touch of ghastliness into the picture. But when, wholly unable to explain or to credit it, he turned his attention to the other tracks and discovered if they too bore similar witness, he noticed that they had meanwhile undergone a change that was infinitely worse, and charged with far more horrible suggestion. And for in the last 100 yards or so he saw that they had grown gradually into the semblance of the parent tread, imperceptibly the change that had come about, yet mistakenly. It was hard to see where the change first began. The result, however, was beyond question. Smaller, neater, more cleanly modeled, They formed now an exact and careful duplicate of the larger tracks beside them. The feet that had produced them had therefore also changed, and something in his mind reared up with loathing, with terror as he saw it. Simpson for the first time hesitated, and then, ashamed of his alarm and indecision, took a few hurried steps ahead. The next instant, stopped dead in his tracks. Immediately in front of him, all signs of the trail ceased. Both tracks came to an abrupt end. On all ends for 100 yards or more, he searched in vain for the least indication of their continuance. There was nothing. The trees were very thick just there, big trees, all of them, spruce, cedar, hemlock. There was no underbrush. He stood, looking about him, all distraught, bereft of any power of judgment. Then he set to work to search again and again, and yet again, but always the same result. Nothing. The feet that printed the surface of the snow thus far had now apparently left the ground. It was in the moment of distress and confusion that all white of terror laid its almost nicely calculated lash about his heart. It dropped with deadly effect upon the sorest spot of all, completely unnerving him. He had been secretly dreading all the time it would come, and it did. Far overhead, muted by great height and distance, strangely thin and wailing, he heard the crying voice of Defago, the guide. The sound dropped upon him out of the still, wintry sky with an effect of dismay and terror surpassed. The rifle fell to his feet. He stood motionless an instant, listening as if there was his whole body, then staggered back against the nearest tree for support, disorganized hopelessly in mind and spirit. To him, in that moment, it seemed the most shattering and dislocating experience he had ever known, and to his heart emptied itself of all feeling whatsoever as by sudden draught. Oh, this fiery height, my feet, oh, my burning feet! Ran and far, beseeching accents of indiscernible appeal, this voice of anguish down the sky. Once it called, then silence through the listening wilderness of the trees. And Simpson, scarcely knowing what he did, presently found himself running wildly to and fro, searching, calling, tripping over roots and boulders, flinging himself in a frenzy of indirect pursuit after the caller. Behind the screen of the mirror, in the motion of which experience veils events, he plunged, distracted and half deranged, picking up false lights like a ship at sea, terror in his eyes and heart and soul. For the panic of the wilderness had called to him in that far voice, the power of the untamed distance, the enticement of dissolution that destroys. He knew in that moment all the pains of someone hopelessly and irrevocably lost, suffering the lust and travail of a soul in the final loneliness. A vision of Defago, eternally hunted, driven, and pursued across the skyey vastness of the ancient forest, fled like a flame across the dark ruin of his thoughts. It seems ages before he could find anything in the chaos of his disorganized sensation to which he could anchor himself and steady for a moment and think. The cry was not repeated. His own hoarse calling brought no response. The inscrutable forces of the wild had summoned their victim beyond recall and held him fast. Yet he searched and called, it seems for hours afterwards, for it was a late afternoon when at length he decided to abandon a useless pursuit and return to his camp on the shores of the 50-island water. Even then he went with reluctance, that crying voice still echoing in his ears. With difficulty he found his rifle and homeward trail, the concentration necessary to follow the badly blazed trees. A biting hunger that gnawed helped to keep his mind steady. Otherwise, he admits the temporary abbreviation he has suffered might have prolonged to the point of positive disaster. Gradually, the balance shifted again, and he regained something that approached his normal equilibrium. But for all that journey through the gathering dusk was miserably haunted. He heard innumerable following footsteps, voices that laughed and whispered, and he saw figures crouching behind trees and boulders, making signs to one another for a concentrated attack the moment he had passed. The creeping murmur of the wind made him start and listen. He went stealthily, trying to hide where possible, and make as little sound as he could. The shadows of the woods, hitherto protected, or covering merely, had now become menacingly challenging, and pageantry to his frightened mind masked a host of possibilities that were all the more ominous for being obscure. The presentiment of the nameless doom lurked ill-concealed behind every detail of what happened. It was really admirable how he emerged victor at the end. Men of riper powers and experience might have come through the ordeal with less success. He had himself tolerably well in hand, all things considered, and his plan of action proves it, sleep being absolutely out of the question, and traveling an unknown trail in the darkness equally impracticable. He sat up in the whole of that night, rifle in hand, before a fire he never for a single moment allowed to die down. The severity of the haunted vigil marked his soul for life, but it was successfully accomplished, and with the very first signs of dawn, he set forth upon the long journey to home camp to find help. As before, he left a written note to explain his absence and to indicate where he had left in a plentiful cache of food and matches, though he had no expectation of any human hands would find them. How Simpson found his way alone by the lake and forest might well make a story itself, for to hear him to tell it is to know the passionate loneliness of the soul that a man would feel that the wilderness holds in the hollows of its illimitable hand, and laughs. It's also to admire his indomitable pluck. He claims no skill, declaring that he followed the almost invisible trail mechanically and without thinking. And this, doubtless, is the truth. He relied upon the guiding of the unconscious mind, which is instinct. Perhaps true sense of orientation, known to animals and primitive men, may have helped as well, for through all of that tangled region he succeeded in reaching the exact spot where Defago had hidden the canoe nearly 3 days before that remark. Strike due west across the lake and with the sun to find the camp. There was not much sun left to guide him, but he used his compass the best of his ability, embarking in the frail craft for at least 12 miles of his journey with a sensation of immense relief that the forest was at last behind him. And fortunately, the water was calm. He took his line across the center of the lake instead of coasting around the shores for another 20 miles. Fortunately, too, the other hunters were back. The light of their fires furnished a steering point without which he might have searched in the night for an actual position of the camp. It was close upon midnight all the same when his canoe grated the sandy cove, and Hank, Punk, and his uncle, disturbed in their sleep by his cries, ran quickly down and helped the very exhausted and broken specimen of a Scotch humanity over the rocks toward a dying fire. Chapter 6. The sudden entrance of his prosaic uncle into this world of wizardry and horror that had haunted him without interruption now for 2 days and 2 nights had the immediate effect of giving to the affair an entirely new aspect. The sound, that crisp, "Hula, my boy! And what's up now?" and the grasp of that dry, vigorous hand introducing another standard of judgment, a revulsion of feeling washed through him. He realized that he had let himself go rather badly. He even felt vaguely ashamed of himself. The native hard-headedness of his race reclaimed him. And this, doubtless, explains why he had found it so hard to tell the group around the fire everything. He told enough, however, for the immediate decision to be arrived at. The relief party must start at the earliest possible moment, and that Simpson, in order to guide it capably, must first have food and above all sleep. Dr. Cathcart observed the lad's condition more shrewdly than his patient knew. Gave him a very slight injection of morphine. For 6 hours he slept like the dead. From the description carefully written out afterwards by the student of divinity, it appears that the account he gave to the astonished group omitted sundry vital and important details. He declares that, with his uncle's wholesome matter-of-fact contumacy staring him in the face, he simply had not the courage to mention them. Thus all the search party gathered, and it seemed was that Defago had suffered in the night an acute and inexplicable attack of mania, and imagined himself called by someone or something, had plunged into the bush without a rifle or food, where he must die a horrible and lingering death by cold and starvation unless he could be found and rescued in time. In time, moreover, meant at once. In the course of the following day, however, they were off by 7, leaving Punk in charge with the instructions to have food and fire always ready. Simpson found it possible to tell his uncle a good deal more of the story's true inwardness, without divining that it was drawn out of him as a matter of fact by a very subtle form of cross-examination. By the time they had reached the beginning of the trail, where the canoe was laid up against the return journey, he had mentioned how DeFago spoke vaguely of something he called a Wendigo, how he cried in his sleep, how he imagined an unusual scent about the camp, and had betrayed other symptoms of mental excitement. He had also admitted that the hysterical condition as he felt afterwards, that he had heard the vanished guide call for help. He omitted the singular phrases used, for he simply could not bring himself to repeat the preposterous language. Also, while describing how the man's footsteps in the snow had gradually assumed the exact miniature likeness of the animal's plunging tracks, he left out the fact they had measured wholly incredible distance. It seemed a question nicely balanced between the individual pride and honesty, what he should reveal and what suppressed. He mentioned the fiery tinge in the snow, for instance, yet shrank from telling that body and bed had been partially dragged out of the tent. With the net result that Dr. Cathcart, a psychologist that fancied himself to be, had assured him clearly enough exactly where his mind, influenced by loneliness, bewilderment, and terror, had yielded to strain and invited delusion. While praising his conduct, he managed at the same time to point out where, when, and how his mind had gone astray. He made his nephew think himself finer than he was by Jewish praise, yet more foolish than he was by minimizing the value of evidence. Like many other materialists, that is, he lied cleverly on the basis of insufficient knowledge, because the knowledge supplied seemed to have his own particular intelligence inadmissible. The spell of these terrible solitudes, he said, cannot leave any mind untouched, and any mind, that is, possessed of the higher imaginative qualities, it has worked upon yours exactly as it worked upon my own when I was your age. The animal that hunted your little camp was undoubtedly a moose, for the belling of a moose may have sometimes a very peculiar quality of sound. The color, appearance of the tracks was obvious, a defect of the vision of your own eyes produced by excitement. The size and stretch of the tracks we should prove when we come to them. But the hallucination of an audible voice, of course, is one of the commonest forms of delusion due to mental excitement. An excitement, my dear boy, perfectly excusable, and let me add wonderfully controlled by you under the circumstances. For the rest, I am bound to say you have acted with splendid courage, for the terror of feeling oneself lost is nothing short of awful, and I had been in your place, I don't for a moment believe I could have behaved with 1/4 of your wisdom and decision. The only thing I find it uncommonly difficult to explain is that damn odor. It made me feel sick, I assure you, declared his nephew, positively dizzy. His uncle's attitude of calm omniscience, merely because he knew more psychologically formula, made him slightly defiant. It was so easy to be wise in the explanation of an experience one has not personally witnessed. A kind of desolate and terrible odor is the only way I can describe it, he concluded, glancing at the features of the quiet, unemotional man beside him. I can only marvel, was the reply, that under the circumstances it did not seem to you even worse. The dry words, Simpson knew, hovered between the truth and his uncle's interpretation of the truth. At this last, they came to the little camp and found the tent still standing. The remains of the fire and a piece of paper printed to the stake beside it, untouched. The cache, horribly contrived by inexperienced hands, however, had been discovered and opened by muskrats, mink, and squirrel. The matches lay scattered about the opening, but the food had been taken to the last crumb. Well, fellers, he ain't here, exclaimed Hank loudly over his fashion, and that's as certain as a coal supply down below. But where he's got to by this time is about as uncertain as the trade in crowns in t'other place. The presence of the divinity student was no barrier to his language at such time. though for the reader's sake, it may have been severely edited. I propose, he added, that we start out at once and hunt for him like hell. The gloom of Defago's probable fate oppressed the whole party with a sense of dreadful gravity in the moment they saw the familiar signs of the recent occupancy, especially the tent with the bed palm's branches still smooth and flattened by the pressure of his body, seemed to bring his presence nearer to them. Simpson, feeling vaguely as if his world were somehow at stake, went about explaining the particulars in a hushed tone. He was much calmer now, though over-wearied with the strain of his many juries. His uncle's method of explaining away, the details still fresh in his haunted memory helped, too, put ice upon his emotions. And that's the direction he ran off, he said to his two companions, pointing to the direction where the guide had vanished that morning in the gray dawn. Straight down there he ran like a deer in between birch and hemlock. Hank and Dr. Cathcart exchanged glances. And it was about 2 miles down there in a straight line, continued the other, speaking with something of a former terror in his voice, that I followed his trail to the place where it stopped dead. And where you heard him calling and caught a stench and all the rest of the wicked entertainment, cried Hank, with a volubility that betrayed his keen distress. And where your excitement overcame you to the point of producing illusions, added Dr. Cathcart under his breath, yet not so low that his nephew did not hear him. It was early in the afternoon, for they had traveled quickly, and there was still 2 good hours of daylight left. Dr. Cathcart and Hank lost no time in beginning the search, but Simpson was too exhausted to accompany them. They would follow the blazed marks on the trees, and where possible his footsteps. Meanwhile, the best he could do was keep a good fire going and rest. But after something like 3 hours' search, the darkness already down, the 2 men returned to the camp with nothing to report. Fresh snow had covered all the signs, and though they followed the blazed trees to the spots where Simpson had turned back, they had not discovered the smallest indication of a human being, or for that matter, of an animal. There was no fresh tracks of any kind. The snow lay undisturbed. It was difficult to know what was best to do, though in reality there was nothing more they could do. They might stay and search for weeks without much chance of success. The fresh snow destroyed their only hope, and they gathered round the fire for supper, a gloomy and despondent party. The facts indeed were sad enough, for Defago had a wife at Rat Portage, and his earnings were the family's sole means of support. Now that the whole truth and all of its ugliness was out, it seemed useless to deal with the further disguise or pretense. They talked openly of the facts and probabilities. It was not the first time, even in the experience of Dr. Cathcart, that a man had yielded in a singular seduction of the solitudes and gone out of his mind. Defago, moreover, was predisposed to something of the sort, for he had already had a touch of melancholy in his blood, and his fibre was weakened by the bouts of drinking that often lasted for weeks at times. Something on this trip, one might never know precisely what, had sufficed to push him over the line. And that was all. He had gone off into the great wilderness of trees and lakes to die by starvation and exhaustion. The chances against his finding camp again were overwhelmed. The delirium that was upon him would also doubtlessly have increased, and was quite likely might do violence to himself and so hasten his cruel fate. Even while they talked, indeed, the end had probably come. On the suggestion of Hank, his old pal, however, they proposed to wait a little longer and devote the whole of the following day, from dawn to darkness, to the most systematic search they could devise. They would divide the territory between them. They discussed their plan in great detail. All that men could do, they would do, and meanwhile they talked about the particular form of which the singular panic of the wilderness had made its attack upon the mind of the unfortunate guide. Hank, though familiar with the legend in its great outline, obviously did not welcome the turn in conversation it had taken. He contributed little, though that little was illuminating, for he admitted that the story ran all over this section of the country to the effect that several Indians had seen the Wendigo along the shores of the 50 Island water in the fall of last year, and that this was the true reason Defago's disinclination to hunt here. Hanks doubtlessly felt that he had the sense of helped his old pal to death by over-persuading him. When an Indian goes crazy, he explained, talking to himself more than the others, it seemed, it always put that he's seen the Wendigo, and poor old Defago was superstitious down to his very heels. And then Simpson felt the atmosphere more sympathetic, told over again the full story of his astonishing tale. He left out no details this time. He mentioned his own sensations and gripping fears. He only omitted the strange language used. But Defago surely had told you about all these details of the Wendigo legend, my dear. I mean, he had talked about it, and thus put it in your mind all these ideas for your own excitement afterwards developed. Wherein Simpson began repeating the facts. Defago, he declared, had barely mentioned the beast. He, Simpson, knew nothing of the story, and so far as he remembered, had never even read about it. Even the word was unfamiliar. Of course, he was telling the truth, and Dr. Cathcart was reluctantly compelled to admit that the singular character of the whole affair. He did not do this in words so much as a manner. However, he kept his back against the good stout tree. He poked the fire into a blaze the moment it showed signs of dying down. He was quicker than any of them to notice the least sound in the night about them. A fish jumping in the lake, a twig snapping in the bush, the dropping of an occasional fragment of frozen snow from the branches overhead where the heat loosened them. His voice, too, changed a little in quality, became a shade less confident, lower of some of the tone. Fear, to put it plainly, hovered close about that little camp, and though all three would have been glad to speak of other matters, the only thing they seemed to be able to discuss was this, the source of their fear. They tried other subjects in vain, and there was nothing to say about them. Hank was the most honest of the group. He said next to nothing. He never once, however, turned his back to the darkness. His face was always to the forest. When the wood was needed, he didn't go farther than necessary to get it. Chapter 7. A wall of silence wrapped them in from the snow, though not thick, was sufficient to deaden any noise, and the frost held things pretty tight besides. No sound but their voices and a soft roar of the flames made itself heard. Only from time to time, something soft as a flutter of the pine moth's wings went past them through the air. No one seemed anxious to go to bed. The hours slipped towards midnight. The legend is picturesque enough, observed the doctor after one of the longer pauses, speaking to break it rather than because he had anything to say. For the Wendigo is simply the call of the wild, personified, which some natures hear to their own destruction. That's about it, Hank said presently, and there's no misunderstanding when you hear it. It calls you by name right enough. Another pause followed. Then Dr. Cathcart came back with the forbidden subject with a rush that made others jump. The allegory is significant, he remarked, looking at him into the darkness, for the voice, they say, resembles all the minor sounds of the bush, wind, falling water, cries of the animals, and so forth. And once the victim hears that, he's off for good, of course. His most vulnerable points, moreover, are said to be the feet and the eyes. The feet, you see, for the lust of wandering, and the eyes for the lust of beauty. The poor beggar goes out in such a dreadful speed that he bleeds beneath the eyes and his feet burn. Dr. Cathcart, as he spoke, continued to peer uneasily into the surrounding gloom. His voice sank into a hushed tone. The Wendigo, he added, is said to burn his feet, owing to the friction apparently caused by the tremendous velocity, till they drop off and the new ones form exactly like its own. Simpson listened in horrified amazement, but it was the pallor on Hank's face that fascinated him most. He would willingly have stopped his ears and closed his eyes had he dared. I don't always keep the ground either, came in Hank's slow, heavy drawl, for it goes so high that he thinks the stars had set him and it'll take great thumping jumps, sometimes long tops of the trees, carrying its partner with it, and then dropping him just as a fish will drop a pickerel to kill it before eating. And its food, of all the muck in the whole bush, is moss. He laughed short, an unnatural laugh. It's a moss eater, is the Wendigo, he added, looking up excitedly into the faces of his companions. Moss eater, he repeated, a string of the most outlandish oaths he could invent. But Simpson now understood the true purpose of this talk. What these two men, each strong and experienced in his own way, dreaded more than anything else was silence. They were talking against time. They were also talking against darkness, against the invasion of panic, against admission and reflection might bring that there was an enemy in this country, against anything, in fact, rather than allow their inmost thoughts to assume control. He himself, already initiated by the awful visual of terror, was beyond both of them in this respect. He had reached the stage where he was immune, but these two, the scuffing and analytic doctor and the honest, dogged backwoodsman, each sat trembling in the depths of his being. Thus the hours passed, and thus with lowered voices and a kind of taut inner resistance of spirit, this little group of humanity sat in the jaws of the wilderness and talked foolishly of the terrible and haunting legend. It was unequal contest, all things considered, for the wilderness had already taken advantage of the first attack, and of a hostage. The fate of their comrade hung over them with a steadily increasing weight of oppression that finally became insupportable. It was Hank, after a long pause, that preceded ones with no one seemed able to break, who first let loose all that pent-up emotion in a very unexpected fashion, by springing suddenly to his feet and letting out the most ear-shattering yell imaginable for the night. He could not contain himself any longer, it seemed. To make it carry even beyond the ordinary cry, he interrupted its rhythm by shaking the palm of his hand before his mouth. "That's for Defago," he said, looking down at the other two with a defiant laugh. "For it's my belief the sandwiched oaths may be omitted, that my old partner is not far from us at this very minute." There was a vehemence and recklessness about his performance that made Simpson, too, start to his feet in amazement, and betrayed even the doctor into letting the pipe slip from between his lips. Hank's face was ghastly, but Cathcart's showed a sudden weakness, a loosening of his faculties. These were. Then a momentary anger blazed into his eyes, and he, too, with a deliberation born of habitual self-control, got upon his feet and faced the excited guide, for this was impermissible, foolish, dangerous, and he meant to stop it in the bud. What might have happened in the next minute or two, one may speculate about, yet never definitely know, for the instant of profound silence that followed Hank's roaring voice, and as though in an answer to it, something went past through the darkness of the sky overhead with terrific speed, something of necessity very large, for it displaced much air. While down between the trees there fell a faint and windy cry of a human voice, calling in tones indiscernible anguish and appeal. "Oh, oh, this fiery height! Oh, oh, my feet of fire, my burning feet of fire!" White to the very edge of his shirt, Hank looked stupidly about him like a child. Dr. Cathcart uttered some kind of unintelligible cry, turning as he did with an instinctive movement of blind terror towards the protection of the tent, then halted in the act as such frozen. Simpson alone of the three retained his presence of the mind a little. His own horror was too deep to allow of any immediate reaction. He had heard that cry before. Turning to his stricken companions, he said almost calmly, "That's the exact cry I heard, the very words he used." Then lifting his face to the sky, he cried aloud, "Defago, Defago, come down here to us, come down!" And before there was time for anybody to take a definite action, one way or another, the sound of something dropping heavily between the trees, striking the branches on the way down, and landing with a dreadful thud upon the frozen earth below. The crash and thunder of it was really terrific. "That's him," So help me God, came from Hank in a whispering cry, half choked, his hand going automatically toward the hunting knife at his belt. And he's coming. He's coming, he added with an irrational laugh of horror, as the sounds of heavy footsteps crunching over the snow became indistinctly audible, approaching through the blackness towards the circle of light. And while those steps, with their stumbling motion, moved nearer and nearer upon them, the three men stood around that fire, motionless and dumb. Dr. Cathcart had the appearance of a man who suddenly withered. Even his eyes did not move. Hank, suffering shockingly, seemed on the verge again of a violent action, yet did nothing. He, too, was hewn of stone. Like stricken children they seemed, the picture was hideous, and meanwhile, their owner still invisible, the footsteps came closer, crunching the snow. It was endless, too prolonged to be quite real, this measured and pitiless approach. It was accursed. Chapter 8. Then at the length of the darkness, having thus laboriously conceived, brought forth a figure. It drew forward into the zone of uncertain light where fire and shadows mingled not 10 feet away, then halted, staring at them fixedly. The same instant it started toward them again with spasmodic emotion as of a thing moved by wires, and coming up closer to them. Full into the glare of the fire, they perceived then that it was a man. Apparently that this man was Defago. Something like a skin of horror almost perceptibly drew down in that moment. Over every face, and 3 pairs of eyes shone through as though they saw across the frontiers of normal vision into the unknown. Defago advanced, his tread faltering and uncertain. He made his way straight up to them, as the group first, and then sharply turned and peered close to the face of Simpson. The sound of a voice issued from his lips. "Here I am, Boss Simpson. I heard someone calling me." It was a faint, dried-up voice made wheezy and breathless by immense exertion. "I'm having a regular hellfire kind of trip I am," he laughed, thrusting his head forward towards the other's face. But that laugh started the machinery of the group of wax-forward figures with wax-white skin. Hank immediately sprung forward with a stream of oaths too far-fetched that Simpson did not recognize them as English at all. But though he had lapsed into Indian or some other lingo, he had only realized that Hank's presence, thrust between them, was welcome, uncommonly welcome. Dr. Cathcart, though more calm and leisurely, advanced behind him, heavily stumbling. Simpson seems hazy as to what was exactly said and done in those next few seconds, for the eyes of that detestable and blasted visage peering at such close quarters into his own utterly bewildered his senses at first. He merely stood still. He said nothing. He had not the trained will of the older men that forced them into action in defiance of all the emotional stress. He watched them, moving as behind a glass that half destroyed their reality. It was dreamlike, perverted yet. Through the torrent of Hank's meaningless phrases, he remembers hearing his uncle's tone of authority, hard and forced, saying several things about food, warmth, blankets, whiskey, and the rest, and further the whiffs that penetrated an unaccustomed odor, vile, yet sweetly bewildering, assailed his nostrils during all that followed. He was no less a person than himself, however, less experienced and adorant than the others though he was, who gave instinctive utterance to the sentence that brought a measure of relief into the ghastly situation by expressing doubt and thought in each one's heart. "It is you, isn't it, Defago?" he asked under his breath, horror breaking his speech. And at once Cathcart burst out into a loud answer before the other had time to move his lips. "Of course it is! Of course it is! Only, can't you see? He's nearly dead with exhaustion, cold, and terror. Isn't that enough to change a man beyond all recognition?" It was said in order to convince himself as much as to convince the others. The overemphasis alone proved that, and continually while he spoke and acted, he held a handkerchief to his nose. That odor pervaded the whole camp. For the Defago, who sat huddled by the big fire, wrapped in blankets, drinking hot whiskey and holding food in wasted hands, was no more like the guide they had last seen alive than the picture of a man of 60, like a daguerreotype of his early youth in the costume of another generation. Nothing really can describe that ghastly caricature, that parody masquerading there in the firelight as Defago. From the ruins of the dark and awful memories he still retains. Simpson declares that the face was more animal than human. The creature had drawn features about into wrong proportions, the skin loose and hanging, as though he had been subjected to extraordinary pressures and tension. It made him think vaguely of those bladder faces blown up by the hawkers on the Ludgate Hill, that change their expression as they swell and they collapse amid the faint and wailing emanation of a voice. Both face and voice suggested some such abominable resemblance. But Cathcart, long afterwards, seeking to describe the indiscernible, asserts that thus might have looked a face and a body that have been in the air so rarefied that the weight of the atmosphere had been removed. The entire structure threatened to fly asunder and become incoherent. It was Hank, though, through all the distraught and shaking with a tearing volume of emotion he could neither handle nor understand, who brought things to head without much ado. He went off a little distance from the fire, apparently so that the light should not dazzle him too much, and shading his eyes for a moment with both hands, shouted in a loud voice that held anger and affection dreadfully mingled. "You ain't Defago! You ain't Defago at all! I don't give a damn, but that ain't you! My old pal of 20 years!" He glared upon the huddled figure as though he would destroy him with his eyes. "And if it is, I'll swab the floor of hell with a wad of cotton wool and a toothpick. So help me good God," he added with a violent fling of horror and disgust. It was impossible to silence him. He stood there shouting like one possessed, horrible to see, horrible to hear, because it was the truth. He repeated himself in 50 different ways, each more outlandish than the last. The woods rang with echoes, and at one time it looked as if he meant to fling himself upon the intruder, for his hand continually jerked towards the long hunting knife on his belt. But in the end he did nothing, and the whole tempest completed itself very shortly with tears. Hank's voice suddenly broke. He collapsed on the ground, and Cathcart somehow or other persuaded him at last to go into the tent and lie quiet. The remainder of the affair, indeed, was witnessed by him from behind the canvas, his white and terrified face peeping through the crack of the tent door flap. Then Dr. Cathcart, closely followed by his nephew, who so far had kept his courage better than any of them, went up with a determined air and stood opposite of the figure of Defago huddled over the fire. He looked him squarely in the face and spoke. At first his voice was firm. "Defago, tell us what happened. Just a little, so that we know how to best help you," he asked in a tone of authority, almost commanding, and at that point it was a command. At once afterwards, however, it changed in quality, for the figure turned up to him a face so piteous, so terrible, and so little like humanity, that the doctor shrank back from him as from something spiritually unclean. Simpson, watching close behind him, says he got the impression of a mask that was on the verge of dropping off, and that underneath they would discover something black and diabolical, revealed in utter nakedness. "Out with it, man! Out with it!" Cathcart cried, terror running neck and neck within the tree. "None of us can stand this much longer." It was a cry of instinct over reason. And then Defago smiled whitely, answered in that thin and fading voice that already seemed passing over into a sound of quite another character. "I seen that great Wendigo thing," he whispered, sniffing the air about him exactly like an animal. "Been with it, too." Whether the poor devil would have said more, or whether Dr. Cathcart would have continued the impossible cross-examination, cannot be unknown. For at that moment the voice of Hank was heard yelling at the top of his voice from behind the canvas that concealed all but his terrified eyes. Such a howling was never heard. His feet! Oh God, his feet! Look at his great changed feet! Defago, shuffled where he sat, had moved in such a way that for the first time his legs were in full sight and his feet were visible. Yet Simpson had no time himself to see properly what Hank had seen, and Hank had never seemed fit to tell. That same instant, with a leap like that of a frightened tiger, Cathcart was upon him, bundling the folds of blanket around his legs, and with such speed that the young student caught little more than a passing glimpse of something dark and oddly masked where moccasined feet ought to have been, and saw even that, but with an uncertain vision. Then, before the doctor had time to do more, or Simpson time to even think of a question, much less ask it, Defago was standing upright in front of them, balancing with pain and difficulty, and upon his shapeless and twisted visage an expression so dark and so malicious that it was, in the true sense, monstrous. "Now you've seen it too," he wheezed. "You've seen my fiery, burning feet, and now that is, unless you can save me and prevent it, it's about time for—" His piteous and beseeching voice was interrupted by a sound that was like a roar of the wind coming across the lake. The trees overhead shook their tangled branches. The blazing fire bent its flames before a blast, and something swept with a terrific rushing noise about the little camp and seemed to surround it entirely in a single moment. Defago shook the clinging blankets from his body, turned towards the woods behind them with the same stumbling motion that had brought him, was gone. Gone before anyone could move a muscle to prevent him, and gone with amazing blundering swiftness that left no time to act. The darkness positively swallowed him, and less than a dozen seconds later, above the roar of swaying trees and the shout of the sudden wind, all three men, watching and listening with stricken hearts, heard a cry that seemed to drop down upon them from the great height of the sky and distance. "Oh, oh, this fiery height! Oh, oh, my feet of fire! My burning feet of fire!" and died away into an untold space of silence. Dr. Cathcart, suddenly master of himself and therefore the others, was able to seize Hank violently by the arm as he tried to dash headlong into the bush. "But I want to know, you," shrieked the guide. "I want to see. That ain't him at all, but some devil that shunted his place." Somehow or other, he admits he never quite knew how he accomplished it. He managed to keep him in the tent and pacify him. The doctor apparently had reached the stage where reaction had set in and allowed his initiate force to conquer. Certainly he managed Hank admirably. It was his nephew, however, hitherto was wonderfully controlled, who gave him most cause for anxiety for the commutative strain of how produced a condition of hysteria, which made it necessary to isolate him upon the bed of boughs and blankets as far removed from Hank and there he lay, as he watches that haunted night pass over the lonely camp, crying startled sentences and fragments of sentences into the folds of his blanket. The quantity of gibberish about speed and height and fire mingled oddly with biblical memories of classroom. People with broken faces all over the fire coming at most awful, awful paces towards the camp. He would moan 1 minute, and the next would sit up and stare into the woods, intently listening and whispering, "How terrible the movements are the feet of them," until his uncle came across to change the direction of his thought and comfort him. The hysteria fortunately proved but temporary. Sleep cured him, just as it had cured Hank. Till the first signs of daylight came, soon after 5 o'clock, Dr. Cathcart kept his vigil. His face was the color of chalk, and there was a strange flushness between the eyes. An appalling terror of the soul battled with his will as though it most silent powers. There was somewhat of the outer signs. At dawn, he lit the fire himself, made breakfast, and woke the others, and by 7 they were well on their way back to home camp, 3 perplexed and afflicted men, but in each his own way having reduced his inner turmoil to the condition of more or less of a systemized order again. Chapter 9. They talked little, and then only of the most wholesome and common things, for their minds were charged with painful thoughts and clamored for explanation, though no one dared to refer to them. Hank, being nearest to primitive conditions, was first to find himself, for he was also less complex. and Dr. Cathcart, civilization, accompanied his forces against singular enough. To this day, perhaps, he is not quite sure of certain things. Anyhow, he took longer to find himself. Simpson, the student of divinity, it was who arranged his conclusion probably with the best, though not most scientific, appearance of order. Out there in the heart of the unreclaimed wilderness, they had surely witnessed something crudely and essentially primitive. Something that had survived. Somehow the advance of humanity had emerged terrifically, betraying a scale of life still monstrous and immature. He envisaged it rather as a glimpse into a prehistoric age, when superstitions, gigantic and uncouth, still oppressed the hearts of man. The forces of nature were still untamed, the powers that may have haunted a primeval universe not yet withdrawn. To this day he thinks of what he termed years later in a sermon savage and formidable potencies lurking behind the trees in the souls of men, not evil perhaps in themselves, yet instinctively hostile to humanity as it exists. With his uncle he never discussed the matter in detail, for the barrier between the two types of mind made it difficult. Only once, years later, something led to the frontier of the subject, of a single detail of the subject, rather. "Can't you even tell me what they were like?" he asked. The reply, though conceived in wisdom, was not encouraging. "It is far better you should not try to know, or to find out." "Well, that odor," persisted the nephew. "What did you make of it?" Dr. Cathcart looked at him and raised his eyebrows. "Odors," he replied, "are not as easy as sounds and sights of telepathic communication. I make as much or as little, probably, as you do yourself." He's not quite so glib as usual with his explanations, that's all. At the fall of the day, cold and exhausted and famished, the party came to the end of the long portage and dragged themselves into the camp. At the first glimpse, it seemed empty. Fire there was none, and no punk came forward to welcome them. The emotional capacity of all three was too overspent to recognize either surprise or annoyance, but the cry of spontaneous affection that burst from the lips of Hank as he rushed ahead of them towards the fireplace came probably as a warning that the end of the amazing affair was not quite yet. And both Cathcart and his nephew confessed afterwards that when they saw him kneeling down in excitement and embrace something that reclined, gently moving beside the extinguished ashes, they felt in their very bones that something would prove to be Defago, the true Defago, returned. And so indeed it was. It was soon told, exhaustion to the point of emaciation. The French-Canadian, what was left of him, that is, fumbled among the ashes trying to make a fire, his body crouching there, weak fingers obeying feebly the instinctive habit of a lifetime of twigs and matches. But there was no longer any mind to direct the simple operation. The mind had fled beyond recall, and with it, too, had fled memory. Not only recent events, but all previous life was blank. This time it was the real man, though incredibly and horribly shrunken. On his face was no expression of any kind whatever. Fear, welcome, or recognition. He did not seem to know who it was that embraced him, or who it was that fed and warmed and spoke to him in words of comfort and relief. Forlorn and broken beyond all reach of human aid, and the little man did meekly as he was bidden. The something that had constituted him individually had vanquished forever. In some ways, it was more terribly moving than anything they had yet seen. That idiot smile as he drew wads of coarse moss from his swollen cheeks and told them that he was a damned moss-eater, and continued vomiting even the simplest foods. And worst of all, the piteous and childish voice of complaint, of which he told them that his feet pained him, burned like fire, which was natural enough when Dr. Cathcart examined them and found that they both were dreadfully frozen. Beneath the eyes were faint indications of recent bleeding. The details of how he survived the prolonged exposure, of where he had been, or of how he covered the great distance from one camp to another, including an immense detour of the lake, on foot since he had no canoe, all that remains unknown. His memory had vanished completely, and before the end of the winter, whose beginning witnessed this strange occurrence to Fago, bereft of mind, memory, and soul, had gone with it. He lingered only a few weeks. And what Punk was able to contribute to the story throws no further light upon it. He was cleaning fish by the lake shore about 5 o'clock in the evening, an hour, that is, before the search party returned, when he saw this shadow of the guide picking its way weakly back into camp. In advance of him, he declares, came the faint whiff of a certain singular odor. That same instant, old Punk started for home. He covered that entire journey of 3 days as only Indian blood could cover it. The terror of a whole race drove him. He knew what all it meant. Defago had seen the Wendigo.
And that's the end of tonight's Tale by the Fire. Thanks for joining me under the moonlight, where the stories come alive and the night listens in. If you felt the magic, howl that love by hitting subscribe, tapping the bell, and sharing the story with your pack. Until next time, stay curious, stay cozy, and keep your ears open. Snaggy Wolf signing off, but the fire never truly goes out.